It started with whispers in the church pews, people fainting during sermons, a choir member collapsing mid-hymn. At first, no one thought twice about it: heat stroke, exhaustion, maybe even the flu. But by the time the 23rd person fell ill, the town of Willow Creek was terrified. Everyone trusted Pastor Daniel Moore. He was a man of faith, soft-spoken, always with a kind smile. His wife, Evelyn, was the perfect pastor's wife. Modest dresses, Sunday casseroles, a gentle voice that soothed every crying child in the congregation. She brought pies to funerals, prayed with the sick, and hugged strangers like they were family. No one suspected her. No one could have imagined that behind those Sunday hats and perfect smiles, Evelyn was keeping a deadly secret. The truth began to unravel one stormy evening when a deacon named Harold Jenkins stumbled out of the church basement, clutching his throat. His face turned purple, his eyes bulged, and he dropped dead before the ambulance even arrived. The coroner's report was chilling. Harold had ingested a lethal dose of antifreeze, disguised in the sweet tea served at the church supper. That was when detectives noticed a terrifying pattern. Over the last year, nearly every sudden death in the congregation had one thing in common. The victims had all eaten or drunk something prepared by Evelyn Moore. But why would the pastor's wife, the woman everyone trusted, be poisoning her own church family? The answer lay in stacks of insurance policies, carefully hidden in a locked drawer beneath Evelyn's vanity. Each policy listed her as the sole beneficiary. Each name matched a face in the pews. And together, the policies added up to nearly $2 million. The people of Willow Creek thought they knew Evelyn Moore. But the woman who smiled in church every Sunday was about to be revealed as something far darker. Evelyn Grace Moore was the kind of woman people called godly without a second thought. She had grown up in the South, in a family that valued appearances above all else. Her mother drilled into her, "A good wife never complains. A good Christian woman smiles through everything." Evelyn had learned to play her role well. By the time she met Daniel Moore, a young seminary student with big dreams of leading his own church, she was already an expert at being exactly what people wanted her to be. To the congregation, they looked like the perfect couple. Pastor Daniel preached about forgiveness and salvation, while Evelyn stood at his side, nodding with a gentle smile, holding hymnals, and greeting everyone at the door. They hosted potlucks, youth nights, and women's Bible studies. From the outside, their marriage looked like a holy union. But inside the walls of their modest parsonage, the cracks began to show. Daniel was devoted to his church, but Evelyn was devoted to control. She hated how money was always tight, how Daniel gave away their savings to families in need. She wanted more: nicer clothes, security, and a life that didn't feel like endless sacrifice. When Daniel told her, "The Lord will provide," Evelyn quietly began looking for ways to provide for herself. It started small. Evelyn worked part-time as the church treasurer. That meant she saw everything: donations, financial struggles, and even the personal details of church members' lives. She knew who was in debt, who was sick, who had life insurance. And that was when the idea first crept into her mind: insurance. She realized that many church members had policies with small payouts, funeral coverage, accidental death, supplemental insurance from employers. But some had much larger ones. And because the community was so trusting, many of them had even asked Evelyn, their beloved pastor's wife, to help them fill out forms. That was how she discovered a loophole. If someone listed her as a secondary beneficiary, or trusted her with signing paperwork, she could make sure her name appeared in the right places. At first, she told herself it was harmless. She rationalized it as God blessing her for all the sacrifices she made. But the first time she saw a payout come through, something inside her shifted. It was after the sudden passing of Mrs. Clara Henderson, an elderly widow who had collapsed at a Sunday dinner. Evelyn had baked the cornbread that day, cornbread she had laced with just enough antifreeze to make Clara sick. When Clara passed a week later, everyone mourned. Evelyn wore black, sang at the funeral, and cried harder than anyone. A month later, a check arrived in her name for $25,000. That money was more than Evelyn had ever seen in her life. It paid off credit cards, bought her new dresses, and funded a secret bank account Daniel didn't know existed. That's when she realized she could do it again. Over the next 2 years, Evelyn refined her methods. She always used small, untraceable doses: a drop in sweet tea, a spoonful in a casserole, a sip of lemonade at a summer picnic. Too little to be detected at first, but enough to make the victims weaker and weaker until their deaths looked natural. Heart failure, stroke, complications of age. She picked her victims carefully. Always the lonely, the elderly, or the sick, those no one would suspect foul play in. And each time, she made sure she was written somewhere in the fine print of their insurance policies. To the congregation, Evelyn was an angel. To herself, she was finally free from a life of poverty. What she didn't know was that one of her victims had left behind something she couldn't control, something that would lead straight back to her. It began with whispers. After Harold Jenkins collapsed in the basement, the congregation couldn't ignore it anymore. Too many funerals, too many sudden illnesses. The church bulletin had begun to look more like an obituary column than a calendar of Sunday events. At first, people blamed the drinking water. Others blamed stress or bad luck. But behind closed doors, some of the members began asking the question no one wanted to say aloud. Why are so many people connected to this church dying? Detective Marissa Cole was the first outsider to connect the dots. A 39-year-old investigator with a reputation for digging where others wouldn't, she was assigned Harold's case after the coroner flagged the antifreeze poisoning. It didn't fit. Harold had no enemies, no debts, and no reason to ingest something so toxic. But when she traced the last place he had eaten, the church supper, her instincts told her something was off. She attended a Sunday service, slipping into a back pew. She watched Pastor Moore preach fire and forgiveness from the pulpit, while Evelyn moved through the crowd with her perfect smile, passing out cookies and coffee. Every handshake was warm, every hug convincing. But Marissa noticed something subtle. Evelyn always lingered when people were drinking. She'd tilt her head, watching them sip. And when Harold's widow thanked her for making his favorite lemonade at the supper, Marissa's gut twisted. The deeper she dug, the worse it got. In 2 years, 23 members of the church had died unexpectedly, and every single one of them had some kind of tie to Evelyn, either through meals she prepared, forms she had helped with, or insurance policies she had quietly encouraged them to sign. When Marissa subpoenaed bank records, the truth was undeniable. Evelyn had quietly deposited more than $1.8 million into an account under her maiden name. But here was the problem. Evidence wasn't proof. The poison was subtle. Most of the bodies had already been buried, some cremated. And Pastor Daniel Moore, beloved, respected, insisted his wife was innocent. "Evelyn has been by my side for 20 years, he told Marissa during questioning, his eyes watery with conviction. "She's a woman of God, a servant to this church. If you're accusing her, you're accusing me too." The congregation split. Some believed the pastor, others whispered about the angel of death in the kitchen. Rumors spread like wildfire, dividing families, friendships, and faith itself. Meanwhile, Evelyn smiled through it all. She baked casseroles for grieving widows. She sang louder in church choirs. She even started teaching Sunday school. But Detective Marissa wasn't fooled. She knew Evelyn had grown cocky. And when people like her grew too comfortable, they always made one mistake too many. That mistake was coming, and it would tear the entire church apart. It happened on a rainy Wednesday night. The church kitchen was bustling, pots steaming, and trays of food stacked high for another midweek supper. Evelyn wore her usual pastel apron with embroidered flowers, humming a hymn while she stirred the giant pot of stew. To anyone watching, she looked like the perfect hostess, the kind of woman who held a congregation together. But Detective Marissa Cole had been waiting for this moment. She'd secured a quiet warrant, installed hidden cameras, and placed undercover officers among the congregation. Every move Evelyn made that night was being watched. At 6:42 p.m., Evelyn leaned over the pot of stew with a silver thermos in her hand. It looked like she was just adding seasoning. But when the lab later tested what was inside, they'd find it was ethylene glycol, antifreeze, the same poison that had been killing her flock one by one. Marissa's heart pounded as she watched through the monitor in the church office. The cameras caught Evelyn unscrewing the cap, tilting her wrist, and pouring in a stream of clear liquid. Then she stirred as if nothing had happened, smiling as she sprinkled parsley on top. But Evelyn wasn't just poisoning for money anymore. This supper had no insurance ties, no financial gain. This was power. This was thrill. And that was her mistake. At 7:05 p.m., Evelyn carried the pot out to the tables. Plates were being filled, children were laughing, and the rain outside beat against the stained glass windows. Marissa knew she couldn't wait any longer. She stormed into the dining hall, her badge flashing under the bright lights. "Nobody eat!" she shouted. Forks froze in midair. Gasps echoed through the room. Evelyn turned, her ladle dripping stew back into the pot. "Detective Cole," Evelyn said sweetly, her voice as smooth as honey. "What is the meaning of this?" Marissa's eyes locked on her. "Step away from the food, Evelyn. Now." The room went silent. Even Pastor Moore rose from his chair, confusion etched on his face. "Detective, this is outrageous. Evelyn would never—" But before he could finish, one of the undercover officers lifted the thermos from Evelyn's bag and set it on the table. "We know what's inside," he said. The pastor's face went pale. His lips trembled. Evelyn's eyes flickered just for a second, with something cold and sharp. Then her mask returned, and she smiled. "Insurance money? Poison in the Lord's house? That's what you're accusing me of?" She laughed softly, shaking her head. "Detective, you're grasping at shadows." But the congregation wasn't buying it. Whispers turned into angry murmurs. Some women cried, others clutched their children's hands tighter. And then Harold Jenkins's widow stood up from her chair, her voice breaking. "You killed him. You killed my Harold." The room erupted. Evelyn, once the beloved heart of the church, was suddenly surrounded by suspicion, betrayal, and fear. And for the first time, her perfect act began to crack. But Evelyn wasn't done fighting yet. She still had one card left to play. The dining hall exploded in chaos. People were shouting, some pushing back from their plates, others rushing their children toward the door. The once warm fellowship of the church had transformed into a storm of fear. Detective Marissa Cole raised her voice over the noise. "Everyone stay calm. Nobody leave until this food is secured." Officers moved quickly, confiscating plates, covering the pot, sealing evidence. Evelyn stood frozen, her apron still on, her hands resting lightly on the ladle as if she were just another hostess at a family dinner. But her eyes darted, calculating. She knew her perfect image was slipping away. Pastor Moore grabbed her wrist. "Tell me this isn't true," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Evelyn, tell me." For a moment, Evelyn dropped the act. Her smile vanished. She leaned close to him and whispered something only he could hear. His face went white, his knees buckled, and he stumbled back. Marissa's heart hammered. She needed to know what Evelyn had said. As officers approached to place her under arrest, Evelyn did the unthinkable. She knocked over the pot of stew, sending steaming liquid cascading across the table and floor. People screamed, chairs scraped back, and Marissa lunged forward. Evelyn bolted. She ran through the side door of the church, apron flapping behind her, and into the rain-soaked night. Marissa tore after her, slipping on wet grass, sirens wailing in the distance as backup closed in. Evelyn's silhouette moved like a ghost through the graveyard behind the church, weaving between tombstones, her pastel apron glowing under flashes of lightning. "Evelyn, stop!" Marissa shouted, her voice echoing against the stone walls. But Evelyn didn't stop. She reached the edge of the graveyard where a black sedan waited with its engine running. She yanked the door open, but froze. Inside the car was Pastor Moore. His face was pale, his hands trembling on the wheel. Tears streamed down his cheeks. "I can't do this anymore," he said, his voice shaking. Evelyn's eyes widened. "You promised me," she hissed. "You said you'd stand by me no matter what." But Pastor Moore only shook his head. "You told me it was God's will. "You lied, Evelyn. You lied to me, to all of us." That was the final crack in her perfect mask. Evelyn's face twisted with fury. She lunged for the steering wheel, screaming, but Marissa was faster. She grabbed Evelyn from behind, pulling her to the ground as officers swarmed in. Handcuffs clicked shut. The rain pelted down, and the woman who had once been called the angel of the church lay face first in the mud, her crimes no longer hidden. But as they dragged her to her feet, Evelyn turned her head toward Marissa, her voice calm again, almost serene. "This isn't over," she whispered. "You don't even know the half of it." Marissa felt a chill run down her spine, because deep down she knew Evelyn was right. There were more secrets buried in that church, and they were about to come spilling out. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled, cameras flashing, reporters scribbling. The case had become national news, the smiling pastor's wife accused of murdering her own congregation for money. Evelyn walked in wearing a modest blue dress, Bible in hand, her hair pinned neatly. She looked more like a Sunday school teacher than a killer. The jurors couldn't take their eyes off her. Some whispered that she radiated innocence. Others said she was pure evil. Prosecutors laid out the evidence piece by piece: the toxicology reports, the life insurance policies filed under her name, the testimony of families whose loved ones had fallen mysteriously ill. Each detail painted the picture of a woman who had been poisoning quietly, carefully, for years. But Evelyn's defense was a performance worthy of Broadway. On the stand, she wept. She spoke of being misunderstood, of trying to help her church financially. She claimed she was being framed by enemies jealous of her influence in the congregation. Her voice shook as she said, "I loved those people like family. I would never harm them. I am being crucified for being a strong woman beside a great man of God." Some jurors lowered their eyes, visibly moved. But then came the moment that broke everything wide open. Detective Marissa Cole, now the lead witness, walked to the stand carrying a stack of photos and a sealed envelope. The room hushed. "These," Marissa said, holding up the photos, "are handwritten notes found hidden in Evelyn Moore's sewing room." On the screen appeared pictures of a notebook filled with neat cursive. Recipes, but not for food. Recipes for poisons, dosages, symptoms, antidotes. Next to each entry was a name, 23 names, and one name circled in red: Pastor Daniel Moore. Gasps filled the room. The pastor himself sat frozen, staring at the screen, his lips moving silently. Evelyn's mask cracked for the first time. Her smile faded, her face pale as stone. "She wasn't just planning to kill her church," Marissa said, her voice steady. "She was planning to kill her husband and collect his insurance as well." The courtroom erupted. Reporters leapt to their feet. The jury covered their mouths, and Pastor Moore buried his face in his hands. Evelyn leapt up, shouting over the noise. "They don't understand. You were supposed to be next, Daniel. You were going to leave me, weren't you?" Officers rushed to restrain her, but she thrashed violently, screaming words no one could unhear. "They all had to pay. You all had to pay." The jury took only 2 hours to reach a verdict. Guilty on all counts. Evelyn Moore, once the angel of the church, was sentenced to life in prison without parole. She walked out of the courtroom smiling faintly, as if she knew something the rest of the world didn't. The church never recovered. Some members moved away. Others refused to ever set foot inside again. The pews where Evelyn once smiled sweetly at her neighbors now sat empty, gathering dust. But Detective Marissa never forgot the last thing Evelyn whispered as she passed by in chains. "You stopped me, but there are others, just like me, watching, waiting." And for months after, every time Marissa walked into a church, she found herself scanning the faces of those smiling women in the pews, wondering which one of them might be hiding a recipe book of their own.